End of the first part of the book of Daniel this morning. It's kind of divided into two halves, and this has been the Sunday school part of it, where all the familiar Sunday school stories we've been talking about. Hope you're learning some new things, and I hope that Daniel is getting well worn in your Bibles during these months that we're spending here. But in the first 6 chapters, we've seen demonstrated different qualities that are necessary for our surviving the swamp that we find ourselves living in this world. It's an infested swamp that is not kind to Christians. It's not one that is really a familiar and friendly place to live, but it's one where we're called to spend this temporary part of life here as we prepare for life over there. Daniel was in a swamp of his own, a political captive of a foreign land. He was a godly man, wholly committed to his Lord and Master, Jehovah God. The culture around him knew nothing about Jehovah. They had their own gods whom they gave homage. It was really kind of a spiritual culture which couldn't, for the life of them, understand why someone would want to have any other gods than the ones that they had at the list. After all, they were just relics. You only brought them out, only showed respect when the time was right, but certainly not a very big part of life. And so what was so big about this Jehovah God that Daniel was big on? They couldn't understand this Daniel character himself, who was so deeply religious that it consumed much of what he did and what he was and what he said. In Daniel, we've seen how to navigate through the unfriendly waters of the swamp all around us. We've seen the character traits of commitment that are necessary. In chapter 1, we saw that trait, commitment, where when the king required them to be fed like royalty with all the rich, non-kosher food that was just part of the palace diet, instead Daniel stood up and, because of his commitment to being a God-fearing Jew, said that food wasn't acceptable. It wasn't what God had said they could imbibe, they could have part of their life, so he refused it and asked if he could have kosher food, and they granted that. So that took commitment for him to stand up for what he believed in. We see his utter dependence upon God to get him through the quagmire even when his life was at stake in chapter 2, when he was included in the death sentence as all the wise men were going to be killed because no one could interpret the dream. And yet, because of his wisdom that God had granted him, he was able to call around him the 3 friends that he had. He knew the power of corporate prayer. Together they prayed God down, and God gave him the answer, and he was then able to give the answer. So that was because of who he was in God's sight. In chapter 3, we don't see Daniel, but we see his influence, I'm sure, as his 3 friends who were called to bow down to this statue instead stood firm in their belief that Jehovah God was not to be messed with. He was not to be put on a shelf and someone else put in higher honor of him. And they stood for what they believed and endured the flames when the swamp intended for them to be removed from this earth. In chapter 4, we see the quality of speaking the truth even when it could hurt you. He interpreted another dream of the king. In this one, he had to proclaim God's judgment on the king, which could have easily meant his life. But he firmly gave the answer that God had told him to give. The swamp had no power over his commitment to truth. And then in chapter 5, Daniel again was called before another king to pronounce God's judgment and the demise of the Babylonian dynasty when he interpreted the divine handwriting on the wall. But now we come to chapter 6, probably the most popular of all the Sunday school stories, the story of Daniel in the lion's den, where the character quality of integrity stands out in bold display, where even the capital punishment of execution couldn't destroy it. Toward the end of the 19th century, an elderly man and his wife arrived by train at Union Station in Chicago. It was a stormy night. Their train had been delayed, so it was after midnight when they got finally at the downtown hotel that they were hoping to find a vacancy in. The young clerk on duty that night was a man called George Bolt. And he explained to the tired travelers that there were 3 different conventions in town, and his hotel was full, but he'd gladly call around and see if there's room in any others. After several calls, however, it was clear that there were no empty rooms to be found in the Chicagoland area. The young clerk said, I can't send a nice couple like you out into the rain of a night like this. Would you be willing to sleep in my quarters, in my room in the basement? It's not large, but it's clean, and I don't need it tonight because I'm on duty. Well, they gladly accepted his offer. The next morning, the man tried to pay George personally, but the young clerk refused. And then the man said to George Bolt, "You're the kind of man who ought to be the boss of the best hotel in America. Maybe one day I'll build one for you." The young clerk only smiled and said, "I was glad to be of service." Well, several years later, George Bolt received a letter from the elderly man, including a train ticket and a welcome for him an invitation for him to come to New York City. And when George arrived there, the old gentleman took him to the corner of 5th Avenue and 54th Street in Manhattan and said, "This is the hotel I have built for you to manage." George Bolt stared in amazement and then in awe and exclaimed, "You got to be joking." But it was no joke. You see, the old man, whose name was William Waldorf Astor, he's the one that built the dynasty of the Waldorf Astoria hotels. And he was the one that built this magnificent hotel, the first one, for George Bolt to manage. That's how loudly integrity can speak. We don't even think about it when we're operating under this quality because it's such a part of our life, but it stands out so boldly, so starkly in the swamp that we find ourselves in. That's what the story of Daniel and the lion's den is all about. Integrity. Integrity on trial. Now let's remind ourselves a little bit of the setting of this story. Daniel's still in Babylon. He'll remain there for the rest of his life, but a completely different government is now in charge. Remember last chapter, Belshazzar died after he saw the judgment of the writing on the wall, the handwriting on the wall. He died, and Cyrus came in. He's called Darius here, but his name is actually Cyrus. And the Medes took over power in the last verse of chapter 5. And Darius and the Medes received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Remember, by this time, Daniel is well into his 80s. I called my mother on Friday, which was her birthday, and she just turned 80. Did you call, Ken? Okay, good. She had just turned 89. So I pictured Daniel as her age in this chapter. I don't know if he was on the high end of the 80s or middle or where, but we know he's well into his 80s. And just like her, I believe he had good health and all his mental faculties were very capable and very good yet. So when I think of Daniel in this stage of life, I think of my mom. All right, let's read the story. Verse 1 of chapter 6. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be over the whole kingdom, and over these 3 governors, of whom Daniel was one, that the satraps might give account to them, so that the king would suffer no loss. Let me just pause a moment. I want us to understand that this Darius is not the same Darius that was in chapter 5 when the guy that diverted the Euphrates River and allowed them to come underneath the wall into the city to take the city from its inside. It's a whole different guy. That guy's name was actually Ugbera. I would have taken the name Darius too, Ugbera. And he died just a few weeks after that victory. He was called Darius, but that was more of a title than a name. The Darius in this chapter is the one that we know as Cyrus the Great. He was the Persian ruler who eventually allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem 70 years after they were taken into captivity. So that's a bit of the setting. All right, verse 3. Oh, one thing I noticed too, this King Cyrus seems to understand delegation pretty good. He's divided up his kingdom. He knew he couldn't watch over this whole thing, so 120 different governors or whatever were under 3 mid-management people who was supposed to watch over that. Okay? I thought that was kind of interesting. Then, because I like organization, verse 3, then this Daniel, distinguishing himself above the governors and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king gave thought to setting him over the whole realm. I'm sorry, I got to stop and again ask, does this verse sound familiar to you at all? It seems like this is the theme of Daniel's life. Every time he is given a job to do, he did it better than anyone else. He stood out like nobody else as one of a kind. Even though he seemed to not be noticed by King Belshazzar, he kind of faded off into oblivion. This King Cyrus immediately noticed who he was, his qualities. This was a man that he needed in his kingdom. In fact, he was planning, he wanted to make him ruler over the 3 governors. He wanted to put him above, right underneath Cyrus's rulership, but he just hadn't got it done yet. So he really admired this old man. That's unusual, isn't it? We don't usually think about the old people really rising to the top. It's all about vim and vigor of the youth. But anyway, let's go on. Verse 4. So the governors and satraps sought to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find no charge or fault because he was faithful, nor was there any error or fault found in him. Then these men said, we shall not find any charge against this Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God. So these governors and satraps thronged before the king and said thus to him, King Darius, live forever. All the governors of the kingdom, the administrators, the satraps, the counselors, and advisors have counseled together to establish a royal statute to make a firm decree that whoever petitions any god or man for 30 days except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. We want you to be supreme, king. Now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which does not alter. Therefore, King Darius signed the written decree. Now, when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home, and in his upper room, and with his windows open toward Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since early days. He did that every day. It wasn't anything different, even though there was a new law. Then these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplications before his God. And they went before the king and spoke concerning the king's decree. Have you not signed a decree that every man who petitions any god or man within 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? The king answered and said, the thing is true, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which does not alter. So they answered and said before the king, that Daniel, who is one of the captives from Judah, they didn't really list him as one of the governors, but he was a captive from Judah, does not show due regard for you, O king, or for the decree that you have signed, but makes his petitions 3 times a day. And the king, when he heard these words, was greatly displeased with himself, and set his heart on Daniel to deliver him, and he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. Then these men approached the king and said to the king, Know, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and the Persians that no decree or statute which the king establishes may be changed. It's time, the day is running out, let's have the sentence. So the king gave the command, and they brought Daniel, cast him into the den of lions. But the king spoke, saying to Daniel, your God whom you serve continually, he will deliver you. See, there's a knowledge there that he knew who God was. Notice that develops as this goes along. Then a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signets of the Lord, that the purpose concerning Daniel might not be changed. Now the king went to his palace, spent the night fasting, No magicians were brought before him. Also his sleep went from him. Then the king arose very early in the morning and went in haste to the den of the lions. And when he came to the den, he cried out with a lamenting voice to Daniel. The king spoke, saying to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you've served continually, been able to deliver you from the lions? There's hope there. There's knowledge. There's hope that God could. Then Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths so that they've not hurt me, because I was found innocent before him. And also, O king, I have done no wrong before you. Now the king was exceedingly glad for him and commanded he should take Daniel out of the den. So Daniel was taken out of the den, and no injury whatever was found on him, because he believed in his God. And there you see belief coming forth. You need to take knowledge beyond that sphere into the scope of belief, where we really claim it as our own. And the king gave the command, and they brought those men who had accused Daniel, and they cast them into the den of lions, them, their children, and their wives. And the swamp isn't very fair to its own, is it? Why did the wives and the children have to be punished for the deeds of these men? But the whole family was thrown into the lion's den. The lions overpowered them, broke all their bones in pieces before they ever came to the bottom of the den. Then King Darius wrote, to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I am making a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom men must tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and steadfast forever. His kingdom is the one which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall endure to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Mary said last week that I should read these stories for the children, because that's what they understand, and they need to hear it right from the Bible. So I took the time to do that this morning, even though it's a long story. So before we go any further, let's define exactly what this godly virtue is that we need to survive our swamp. Webster helps a little bit when he defines integrity as consistency and sincerity with no deception or pretense. You got to think about that one a bit. Consistency and sincerity with no deception or pretense. I've heard it defined already that it's the person you are when nobody's watching, when nobody's looking. That probably comes close. But I can be someone completely different when I'm off by myself in my private life than what I am in a private public situation, and can be two different people. So I'm not sure that quite covers it either. In fact, a person who isn't a Christian can have integrity in his life because he's living upright and making right choices, and he just hasn't given his life to the Lord. So I'd like to define it a little bit differently this morning, like this: that godly integrity is the spiritual character quality which continually is representative of Christ's likeness in a person's life, no matter the circumstance in which that person is found. It all boils down to being Christ-like in everything. Not a different person when you're on the internet looking at whatever you choose to look at as it draws you further down that road of, did you ever notice that? It's designed to pull you in. You look at something, it's not too bad, and then you got this whole list of other things that keep getting more corrupt as you go on. Oh man, and it really gets, no, a person of integrity is not going to look any differently at something like that than he would if he was sitting in the middle of the church with Jesus looking over his shoulder. That's integrity. That's who I am, no matter who is watching. You know, you young people, after church, you're going to be jumping into 2 vehicles, I think, going somewhere far away from mom and dad for a week to a place where nobody really knows you. But as you go, you are representatives of Bound Mennonite Church, of your family name, and of most importantly, of Jesus Christ. If you're a person of integrity, I hope, which I hope that you are, should anything change in the way you face this week over last week? Probably not, because you're going to react to the same way over the situations that come up in that group situation. Please be kind to Don. I just noticed as he was up here that he doesn't have any hair to pull. And if you put him in situations where he feels like pulling out his hair, it's going to be frustrating to him. So be kind to him. Be persons of integrity there. But if you're not a person of integrity, I hope that you do choose to change and to live differently this week, because our name and reputation is vested in you. And when people look at you, they'll be rubbing, the people you'll be rubbing shoulders with, they'll see you, but I hope when they see you, they with fondness can identify by who you are, that lets them know who Bound Youth Group is, who your family is, and most of all, who Christ is in your life. So, integrity just exudes out of the person who wants to be representative of who God is. Now, you can fake it. People have tried to fake it already. In fact, listen to this story. I heard a story this week of a man who went to a Kentucky Fried Chicken out in California to get some chicken for himself and the young lady that was with him. She waited in the car as he went in and picked up his order, and inadvertently the manager gave him a box of, like you would give a box of chicken. He put his day's earnings in there and was going to take it to the bank, but he was kind of trying to disguise it and put it in one of these boxes. Inadvertently, he gave this guy that box. The man didn't think anything about it, took it to the car, and went off to their place of picnic. When they got there, they opened the box up, discovered this box full of money, which, he could have went and had a grand old time, I'm sure. But realizing what had happened, he got back into his car, returned to the place, gave it to the manager, and the manager, of course, was elated, said, "Hey, just stick around, please. I want to call the newspaper and have them come take your picture. You must be the most honest guy in town." The guy said, "Oh, no, don't do that." And the manager said, "Why not?" "Well, you see, I'm married, and the woman I'm with is not my wife, so don't do that." So on the surface, you can look like a person of integrity, so honest, you'll give the clerk back 25 cents if she overpays you with change at Myers. But when you're alone, your mind gets into all kinds of corruption. So don't fake it. God does no good for God, and it does no good for us. Be genuine when your integrity is on trial. Genuine integrity means that when what's on the inside matches what is on the outside. There's nothing different in secret than what is in public. For the Christian, that means that there's no difference between our beliefs and our behavior. Our beliefs gets translated into the way that we live our life. You can't proclaim to be a Christ follower and turn around and treat somebody like dirt in a business deal. You can't even trash them behind their back. And I've heard people do that think that somebody who you didn't like the deal that you worked out will go back to the rest of the employees and tell them how bad of a person. You can't do that if you're a person of integrity. So with this in mind, what can this familiar story from the golden years of Daniel's life teach us about integrity? See, 4 things that we've got to really quickly go over here. First is that Christian integrity is visible. Daniel stood out as being different. Kings and queens noticed it. Remember last chapter, the queen remembered who Daniel was, even when Belshazzar didn't. The queen said, "Hey, call this man. He's one of a kind." And this king brought this old man up to be his chief leader. Wanted to put him right at the top. We don't do that when you're setting up a new kingdom. You want the new guys, the guys with new vision, who wants to spend time on old men? They might have wisdom, but they don't have the drive and the excitement of somebody new. Not Cyrus. He sees in Daniel the best in the kingdom except for himself. Like I said, he wanted to put him in number 2 command. He just hadn't done it yet. But why was that? Why did he see that in him? After all, he couldn't have known him very well. He wasn't king very long. But there must have been a whole aura of upright reputation surrounding his being. It really reminds me of this verse in Philippians 2:12 to 16. In fact, this would be a great verse for you youth to focus on this week. It says this, or a passage I should say. It says this, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you both to will and to do his good pleasure. Do all things without complaining and disputing, that you may become blameless and harmless, children of God without fault in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world, holding fast the word of life. Boy, if that's a theme for any of us in the Christian life, that ought to be it. It's all there in a nutshell, but that's integrity. Living as you know Christ would want you to live. Daniel was that type of star. In fact, his character was so upright that his enemies had to create a brand new law against praying to a God who wasn't on their list in order to accuse him. In essence, they had to make integrity illegal in order to have grounds for his arrest. When we live the way God wants us to live, we really mess up the plans of the swamp. They don't know how to deal with us. Are you living your life in such a way that the same could be said of you, which was said of Daniel in verse 4? They could find no charge or fault because he was faithful, nor was there any error or fault found in him. Wow, that's quite a statement. That's what we're called to. Or as someone has said, if you should be arrested for your faith, would there be enough evidence to convict you? How well does your integrity show? Does your life stand out as being a misfit in the swamp, or do you blend in? A person of integrity does not blend into the swamp. All right, secondly, integrity doesn't equate with fair treatment. As we know, Daniel's punishment was not because of something he did wrong, but as something he did right. He was punished for personally praying in the privacy of his own home. I mean, where does his privacy get? Where does the government get off telling us what we can do in the privacy of our own home? He was, and this wasn't something he was doing to antagonize his enemies. He's done it ever since he got there. That was a practice that he and God decided was important. It was who he was. It was what he did. It was integrity which landed Daniel in the lion's den. The swamp doesn't like integrity. Just look at what's happening daily in our government right now. It's almost unbelievable. I mean, I listen to it every day, but I don't know why I do, because it just upsets me, because it's so unreal what's going on. People accused and very evidently guilty of criminal activity, and yet they continue to swim away. Anyway, don't get me started. Don't expect to be rewarded for your integrity. The swamp doesn't work that way. In fact, just the opposite. They don't want to hear anything about godliness. Corruption is the rule of the day. They don't even care anything about truth. All they care about is doing what's necessary to move their agenda forward, no matter who gets hurt in the process. So for Daniel, to be consistent with his convictions meant that he was not worthy to continue living. That's what we have to look forward to as fellow Christians. They hate us. They don't want us around. By the way, did you see the news this week where companies in this country are now requiring their workers to get an electric chip inserted into their hands for them? Right now it's just to unlock doors and to give them access into computer software. Sounds very harmless. The first company it was reported on said that they were it was a voluntary thing for their employees. Second one came out very clearly and said it was mandatory for their employees, and I think it's going to sweep the country very, very quickly. You know, I used to think that the mark of the beast was going to be so evident that we wouldn't have to think twice about whether we would receive it or not. But when it comes subtly like this, it's just a simple little thing that makes life easier and simpler. How are we going to know whether it's the right thing to do or not to do when the Bible warns us about taking that mark? I watched a video this morning. There's a lot more underneath this thing than meets the eye. In fact, the way they named it, 666 is very evident in that. So I think we're moving very quickly that. In fact, this year, I predict someone in this congregation will have to face a decision on whether they're going to receive this chip or not. I don't know if I'm right on that or not, but I look at your big companies like GM or Steelcase, or maybe it's going to be the little companies. Maybe it's going to be tax incentives that say, hey, go ahead, get this done so it's out of the way. But we're going to face that definitely in our lifetime, if not this year. But I think it's very, very close at hand. That's what the rest of the book is going to clarify for us as we go through that. But one thing we know for sure, there will be suffering for those who live a life of integrity during the end times. We need to prepare ourselves in our commitment right now. Are we going to stand for what we know the Bible tells us? What about if it comes down to the fact of, you know, your family's at home, they're hungry, you haven't been able to buy anything for weeks on end, and all you need to do is take this little chip in your hand, and you could have all the food you'd want, everything, the family would be taken care of. I mean, that's your responsibility. How do you decide? What are you going to decide when that comes up? We need to be preparing ourselves in our commitment right now for when that time comes for us. Oh my. Two more results of integrity very quickly. Thirdly, integrity finds its power to stand in prayer. I just want to remind us that the power behind Daniel's reputation was found in his commitment to a life of prayer. He never gave up on God, even though his life seemed very unfair. And then lastly, integrity will have an amazing impact on the swamp. The king had to carry out the sentence. He didn't want to. The law of the Medes and Persians could not be changed. But isn't it interesting that one life of integrity was able to supersede the law? In fact, Daniel experienced a little bit of heaven, I think, in that lion's den, because remember Isaiah talks about how that the lion is going to lay with the calf and a young child's going to lead them. That's what it's going to be like in the millennial kingdom that we're going to experience. So I think Daniel's just experiencing a little bit of heaven down there in that lion's den as he petted the kitties all night and had a good time there. The king, on the other hand, in the swamp was very, very uncomfortable. Now, most scholars doubt that Cyrus ever became a worshiper of Jehovah. It sounds very much like he believes in this chapter, but he did learn respect for God's power so much that he later sent the Jews back to Jerusalem to rebuild. That's not heard of either, for a king to release his slaves, but he did. So I think he got a hold of something that night, whatever it was. I hope that we'll see him in heaven, but I don't know. There's so much more that we didn't get to talk about here in this chapter that is here. I hope that you're digging in and finding it for yourself, but I hope that one thing you take away and think about is that when yours and my integrity is put on trial, will there be enough evidence to convict us as being guilty of a complete sellout to Jesus? Not a fake, not a partial, not just someone who tries to make it look good, but could you be convicted of a complete sellout to Jesus? Live your life in such a way that when someone looks at you, they readily see Jesus in you. That's a challenge, but it's very possible for us to do that. But it's also a commitment we need to make that happen. Let's pray. Thank you, Father, for